Hello again, AP US History students. These will be my last two lectures as we bring our required course of study for the modified AP US History exam to conclusion. So please watch out for the accompanying Google form quiz, which you will see in classroom. All right, well, let's get on with it. A lot of slides to get through. So the last we saw, we had gotten to almost finish with the build-up to the war. And then there was quite a shocking event just before the war started. It was a non-aggression pact concluded between Hitler and Stalin, between the Russians and the Germans. Why would this happen, considering Hitler had such an open public disdain for both the Slavic peoples and for communism? Well, it was quite simply this. It was a marriage of convenience. These men hated each other. Uh, Hitler wanted to ensure that the Russians would not defend the Poles. And in fact, he gave them the incentive of being allowed to carve up the eastern part of Poland. So they carved up Poland between them. It was a despicable act initiated by the Germans, but the Russians shouldn't get off the hook for this one entirely. Right. So that occurred, and of course, this paved the way then for the war. The British and French finally realized that they could no longer stand idly by and reluctantly declared war on Germany. The United States, of course, sat it out. As we discussed in the previous lecture, there was a very great desire in the United States to stay out of European affairs, despite the considerable aggressions of the Nazis, despite their practices and so forth, and discrimination against the Jews. This was not actively considered by the US. Now, how did the war go in the first 2 years? This is not a world history course, so we're going to storm through this. Well, it went very, very well for the Nazis and the Germans. They did have a formidable war machine, the German military tradition, brilliant training, well-led army. They put a lot of money, German industry, into the German war machine, and they used new tactics. They used blitzkrieg, lightning war, which was essentially the use of the Air Force to dive bombers to soften up enemy infrastructure, and then to sweep through with the new Panzers, the very mobile, excellently made German tanks, and then to sweep that up with the disciplined German infantry. How successful was this? Well, it was staggeringly successful. You can see here in the map how the Germans swept through Europe, the fall of the Low Countries, the capture of Norway, and then most shockingly, the fall of France, which happened in rapid course. And the British had to retreat from Dunkirk. Dunkirk, celebrated in Britain as a great escape. In reality, the British really got badly beaten and had to retreat to the fortress of their island, saved by the ocean. This, of course, also, as France was falling, it occurs the Italians to get in. The Italians got into the act. And then eventually we see, once Hitler was the master of continental Europe, he made the fateful decision to invade Russia. We'll talk more about that later. Now, meanwhile, back in the United States, FDR is looking upon this with great alarm. He and many of his advisors greatly worried about these things, feeling that war is coming to the United States. But how do they get around the Neutrality Acts? There is still a majority of the country and in Congress in favor of maintaining neutrality. Well, they do it in a various guises. Two of the most important being cash and carry and the Lend-Lease. Cash and carry basically stated that the British would have to pay for all war materials in cash, and that they would have to carry them away on their own vessels, because these provisions were not strictly denied under the Neutrality Acts. Then, once the British ran out of cash, because yes, this happened, the war almost bankrupted Britain, then they got involved in something called the Lend-Lease. These again were ways of lending materials, renting them out to the British at a high price, it must be said, and eventually this paved the way. And the Neutrality Acts were modified as well. Um, Also, before Pearl Harbor, we have the Atlantic Charter, which FDR and Roosevelt met and agreed on a set of principles. Um, Such as freedoms for people, self determination, economic freedoms. And so clearly, these were things that were leading towards an alliance. FDR moving the country towards this war footing. And as we also covered in the video last week, the video documentary, the first peacetime draft in American history as well, beginning to build up the American armed services in anticipation of something happening. Now, meanwhile, of course, the United States and Japan, the tensions are ramping up between them in the Pacific. Well, why was the US opposed to Japanese expansion? Japanese expansion into Korea, Manchuria, mainland China, down into the Pacific, attacking British targets, British Singapore, and so forth. Why did the Japanese, why did the Americans care? Well, they cared because this is a threat to American interests. This is a hostile nation with a system of government, with a would not with a close relationship with the United States, and they want to muscle in and become the Pacific power. This threatens U.S. interests. What steps did it take? Well, the United States embarked on a series of ever stricter economic sanctions against the Japanese. Now, remember, the Japanese did not have access to a lot of raw materials, especially oil. So the United States put an embargo, a ban on trading of oil with Japan. This hurts the Japanese. They eventually go even further. They freeze all Japanese assets in the United States. And so the idea that Pearl Harbor was a shock attack, well, yes, it was. It was a sucker punch, but not to the extent that people have made out. It was clear that the two countries were coming to a point of no return. So we will come back to that. Well, we have here actually. So we have here Pearl Harbor battle scene from the movie Pearl Harbor. Not a fantastic movie, but this is a wonderful visual, a good job done here. So I'm going to post that in Classroom. Check it out. We'll talk about the reactions of the US. I think that's pretty elementary stuff for you guys. So let's talk then about the US at war. The US at war. The production demands of the war and mobilization of the armed forces marked the final end to the Great Depression. This is a point we touched upon in our New Deal lectures. But what role did the federal government play in this process? Well, first of all, it must be said here that yes, the war was great for the economy, but of course it also ballooned the national debt. As I've said before, this is not a bad thing. According to Keynesian economics, this is a good thing as long as you pay down the debt after. And this is what exactly what happened in the 1950s. We can see here on the graph, this in the graph on the left. So contracts, many lucrative contracts going around during war. Who oversaw this process? Well, we have the expansion, once again, the even greater expansion, the 20th century story, the expansion of the federal government. The war production government oversaw this process and streamlined the process of giving out contracts to companies. Who are these companies? The companies tended to be major corporations, major American corporations, Ford, General Motors, Boeing, and so forth. So we have here, in a sense, a public-private partnership. Was this successful? Was this successful in producing the necessary war materials for the war effort? Absolutely, it was a triumph in productivity. We can see it here in the graph on the left. Hugely successful in producing all sorts of needed ammunition, aircraft, ships, electrical equipment, and so forth. So, what? How did this work out in terms of labor, in terms of unions? What part did they play in this? Well, we can see here the National War Labor Board, the NWLB, insisted upon agreed wages, conditions, insisting upon agreed agreements to double up on that wording there between companies, insisting that everyone's on board. We see it here, three hands coming together. Some people didn't see it that way. John Lewis led a strike by the United Mine Workers, but for the most part, People were on board. People who didn't play ball, companies who refused to accept a adjudication between workers, between unions and corporations. What happened? Well, the federal government, the NWLB, actually seized over 40 plants, control of them during wartime. Unheard of powers. The government seizing control of companies that were not doing things the right way in order to make sure that production stayed on schedule. Right. Well, what about different groups in the labor force? What about women? We can see here that women went from 24% to 36% of the workforce from the start to the finish of the war. This is giving women a much greater role outside the home. That's certainly a positive. Women could feel like they're playing their part in the war effort. What are the downsides to this? Well, the downsides to this, of course, were that women suffered discrimination, sexual harassment on the job. And when the war ended, they were expected to give up these jobs in many cases, especially the better paying ones. This is all hidden, of course, behind the propaganda, war propaganda. On the left, the most famous American war propaganda poster of all time. Here she is in all her splendor, Rosie the Riveter, combining attractive femininity and effectiveness and powerfulness. And this is true, of course, but it is also an image, a piece of propaganda made by the famous Norman Rockwell. More propaganda. On the right, we have women in the armed services. Well, what sort of role did they play? Were they in combat roles in World War II? No, is the answer. They were in support roles. They were driving ambulances. They were behind the lines. They were delivering supplies. We do have women flying planes during World War II, delivering supplies, but they're not bombers, they're not fighter planes, but they are playing a very important role in the supply line of keeping the war effort going. Critical role. Now, what about the black community? How did they fare during the war? What was Executive Order 8802? Well, the executive order, and we see it here being supported on the left in the United We Win poster. There was a great demand for labor during the war. As we know, the Depression ended. There's a shortage of labor now, with men off fighting in the war. And as in World War One, this created opportunities for black workers. And when your labor is desired, you have strength. And the head of one of the oldest African American unions in the country, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Porters, went to the White House, went to FDR, complained of discrimination in arms manufacturing plants, and FDR responded. FDR responded with this executive order which outlawed all forms of discrimination and set up a board to protect black workers. So they certainly did well out of World War II. In the armed services, what was their role? What was the role? In World War One, black soldiers were segregated. Was this the case in World War II, or was there change? Well, the answer is no. They were not given that privilege just yet. They were still segregated, so discrimination continued. However, it can be said that World War II, the record of African Americans in World War II meant that after the war, a couple of years after the war, Truman did actually desegregate the American armed services. The first branch of the American public service to be desegregated. On the right here, we see a picture of the Tuskegee Airmen, definitely the most famous, the most acclaimed, the most iconic of the African American fighting forces in World War II. Now, we've seen some propaganda posters already. We have some more here. Well, what can we say about them? Well, we can say that a lot of the same themes that came up when World War One came up again. A lot of the same things. Dehumanization of the enemy, generating patriotism, shaming people into joining the armed forces. On the left here, we have this really fun rationing poster. Not just rationing, I suppose, urging here the lady in the picture to, and women generally, to can food, to preserve foods, to pickle things, to grow their own food. I do want to say one word on dehumanization posters and attacking the enemy, especially the Nazis, versus the fascists in Italy versus the Japanese. Was there any differences here? And the answer is yes, yes, there was. Um, Although the fascists, and particularly the Nazis, were depicted as a menace, as cold, as evil, they were not treated in the same racist manner as the Japanese. The prevalent racism and hatred of the Japanese was really conspicuous in many respects during World War II. We see it here in the nasty poster on the right, Jab Trap. Now, there is undoubtedly the case that this is partially understandable because of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But as with the Anti Chinese Immigration Act, the Exclusion Act of the previous century, I do think we need to understand this also in the context of racism. Now, this leads us on to the internment of Japanese Americans. Why did this happen? Well, we've already talked about racism. But there was also this fear that Japanese Americans were going to be involved in subterfuge and they would be a fifth column within the United States, take down the United States from within. Now, this was quite irrational considering the very small percentage of Japanese migrants in America, and it's also not backed up by fact, indeed. This was not proven. This alleged disloyalty of Japanese Americans was not in evidence. And also, too, it's fair to say that this was not an accusation leveled at the Germans or the Italians. Where did this urge come from? It came from California. It came from California because that's where the only significant Japanese population was. Still a fraction of the population there. It was supported by the Congress in California, by the governor of California. They put pressure on the FDR administration. They agreed. Went all the way to the Supreme Court, in which the Supreme Court ruled in Korematsu versus the United States that internment was constitutional. At the basis, they deemed it as a military necessity. A military necessity. A dubious ruling, but widely popular in its time. In its time. All right. Okay, let's move on. What other tensions were there? Again, in California, we're seeing tensions here between white people and the growing Hispanic population. The most famous embodiment of this was the Zoot Suit riots of 1943. The Zoot Suits, what were they? Well, this was a distinctive, very distinctive clothing style, fashion worn by young Hispanic migrants. Now, remember, uh, there's a need for labor. These men are being welcomed in, their families are being welcomed in, their parents are being welcomed in to work in the factories, just like African Americans were, just like women were. And but they did tend to migrate, understandably, geographical understanding, to places like LA, like San Francisco. Therefore, we get tensions. The tensions emerged. Again, racism, sectarianism is involved here. The Zoot Suit riots were in reaction to the alleged attack by a group of Hispanic youths on a white sailor, which led to off duty sailors rampaging through and beating up young Hispanic men dressed in the so called Zoot suits. Okay, let's talk a bit about the war. I'm just going to pause this for a second as I check where I am in the slides. I want to cut my lecture in half. Okay, I'll get another 3 or 4 slides in on this lecture. So, the war. We know the United States, the Allies won the war. So, where did this happen? Where did it begin to happen? We know the first half of the war had gone very badly for Britain and France. France was knocked out. How did it turn around? Well, it starts in North Africa, I think. And this is where the Americans and the British decide to try and push back against the Nazis. The Russians, Stalin wanted this to happen in France, but Churchill wasn't ready yet. British weren't ready. He insisted they had to build up their forces, and so they did it in Africa. Now, who are the leading figures here? Well, the leading figure is absolutely General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Ike, as he was popularly known. He was the leading leader of the American forces and the commanding general later at the D-Day landings. I've also put in a photo here of General Patton, one of the other generals. I put him in because he's a really iconic figure, well known for his bluntness, for his colorful phrases, for his tough attitude, and for being a hard man. My favorite General Patton phrase, quote, is you don't win a war by dying for your country. You win a war by making the other son of a bitch die for his country. I have to say, I couldn't resist that one. Also helped in North Africa by the fact that Germany was hindered by its weak Italian ally. Mussolini was a bluffer. The Italians were a divided people, did not want to get into this war. They were found wanting. The Nazis had to help them out in Greece and again had to bail them out in North Africa. And the Germans, even led by their brilliant General Rommel, the Desert Fox, could not resist the joint British and American efforts in North Africa and retreated into Italy. Now, what else can we say about conduct in the war? Well, this is not world history class, but we must remember that 90% of all Nazi German casualties were inflicted upon them by the Russians. By the Russians. Um, so that's worth bearing in mind. So the idea that America won the war on its own is of course, very fanciful. It was a joint effort. Um, the war started really badly for the Russians. They were totally caught by surprise. It is kind of ironic that paranoid Stalin was caught by surprise. The Germans put the largest land invasion in all of world history. We see it here, a three-pronged invasion of the Soviet Union. Um, in the face of this onslaught, the Russians chose tactical retreat. They adopted a scorched earth policy, uh, burning ground and resources as they retreated, using the vastness of Russia against the Americans. The Germans then ran into terrible trouble, getting bogged down into Russia, suffering awfully in the Russian winters. That's plural, winters. And so that turns around. Meantime, in the Battle of the Atlantic, what was happening in the Battle of the Atlantic? Well, this will be my last slide in this lecture. In the Battle of the Atlantic, again, War of Two Halves starts off really badly for the British. German U-boats wreaking absolute havoc in the Atlantic, sending scores of British and then later American ships to the depths. But they turn it around. How do they do this? They do this with American prowess, American know-how, technology, and American industry. Huge number of escort destroyers, Liberty ships pouring out of the dockyards, out of the factories, and they overwhelm the U-boats using latest technology, using radar, using sonar, um, equipped with support from the B-52 bombers and so forth. The hunters, the U-boats, become the hunted. And in fact, German submariners, U-boat submariners, suffered the highest casualty rates of any type of fighting man or woman of all forces and all countries during the war. Three-quarters of German submariners did not survive the war. Um, and that statistic is, again, testament to the capacity and the resoluteness that the Americans brought to this conflict. So I will finish this off in my final lecture. Thank you.